Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The first time Rowan heard the universe humming, it sounded like a lullaby wrapped in static, a gentle frequency that drifted between the spaces where dreams meet memory. It was the kind of sound that lives in the pause between raindrops, in the breath before a whispered secret, in the moment when twilight decides to become night. On this particular October evening, when the aurora borealis painted impossible colors across a sky that shouldn't have been able to hold them, Vera Chen stepped outside the transmission tower's small keeper house and felt the cold air greet her like an old friend, returning after a long absence. She had been working the late shift for 30 years, her voice a steady lighthouse for travelers, lost in the static storms that rolled across the northern frequencies. Tonight felt different, though. The usual crackle of CB chatter and the distant murmur of radio. Waves had softened into something she had never quite heard before, a gentle hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself and reach toward the dancing lights above. Vera pulled her wool coat tighter and followed the sound, her boots crunching softly on frost-touched grass as she walked toward the base of the transmission tower where the guy wires anchored into the ground. There, nestled against the concrete foundation, like a gift left by the aurora itself, she found a baby sleeping in a cocoon of coaxial cable. The thick braided wire should have been cold metal against the October chill, but when Vera knelt and touched it with trembling fingers, it was warm as fresh bread, humming with a frequency that felt like coming home to a place you'd never been. The cable had woven itself around the infant in patterns that looked almost like lace, and as Vera watched, the copper braiding seemed to shift and shimmer with the same ethereal light that painted the sky above. The baby's chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the cable's gentle pulse, and when Vera lifted the child, those deep brown eyes opened to meet hers with a recognition that took her breath away. In that moment, every piece of radio equipment back in the house seemed to exhale in unison, their usual static softening into something that sounded remarkably like welcome. The child made a small sound, not crying, but the contented sigh of someone settling into a warm bed after a very long journey. Vera had spent her adult life translating between the language of loneliness and the dialect of connection, helping lost voices find their way across the static-filled distances between human hearts. But she had never encountered a signal quite like this one, broadcasting pure belonging across frequencies she couldn't name, but somehow understood. She carried the baby inside, past walls lined with vintage equipment that had been humming and crackling for decades, and settled into the rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother. As they crossed the threshold, the old Zenith radio in the kitchen, which had been stuck between stations for years, suddenly found a clear channel playing gentle instrumental music that sounded like rainfall on leaves. The CB radio in the corner began picking up fragments of lullabies from truckers who probably didn't even realize they were humming. The baby's small fist closed around a strand of the copper wire, and the moment those tiny fingers made contact, the cable began to glow with a light so soft it was barely visible, like the last ember of a campfire or the first star appearing in twilight. Outside her window, Vera could see the rowan trees standing with their last red berries like lanterns in the cold, bending gracefully in the wind without breaking. She looked from the trees to the child and felt a name arrive without fuss, settling into her heart as naturally as the baby had settled into her arms. "Rowan," she whispered to the air, trying it on the child's ear. "For bending without breaking. For resilience. For the kind of strength that knows when to yield." The coaxial cable continued its soft rhythmic hum, a constant gentle pulse that filled the room like a heartbeat. Vera understood without being told that it was meant to stay with them, a connection to whatever frequency had carried this small soul across the vast distances between here and wherever they had begun their journey. As she rocked in the chair that had soothed 3 generations of restless nights, she felt the strange certainty that this child had been traveling for a very long time before arriving in her small corner of the world. The aurora borealis continued its impossible dance across the northern sky, painting the transmission tower in shades of green and gold that pulsed in rhythm with the sleeping baby's heartbeat. Vera had always believed that the electromagnetic spectrum held more conversations than most people realized. But tonight, she understood that some frequencies carried more than words or music. Some signals carried love itself, broadcasting it across whatever distances needed to be crossed to deliver exactly the right soul to exactly the right doorstep at exactly the moment when someone was ready to receive the gift of caring for another. And, as the night settled deeper around them, the house exhaled one final contented sigh, readying itself for a life that would learn to listen where others only heard noise. Morning arrived like a gentle exhale, the light slipping through curtains that had spent the night, filtering aurora colors into something soft enough for dreams. Vera woke to find Rowan still sleeping in the wooden crate she had lined with her grandmother's quilts. The coaxial cable draped around the edges, like a protective charm that hummed with the same warm frequency as the night before. What struck her most was not the silence, but the quality of peace that seemed to flow from the sleeping child and settle into every corner of the small house like honey spreading through warm bread. The snow outside had continued falling through the night, each flake landing without sound on the transmission tower and the rowan trees that stood like patient guardians in the yard. As Vera moved quietly through her morning routine, she noticed that the usual crackle and hiss of her old equipment had softened into something almost musical. The kitchen radio, which typically fought for clear reception until noon, was playing a gentle instrumental piece that sounded like rainfall on leaves. The CB radio in the corner murmured with distant conversations that felt more like companionship than interruption. When Rowan woke, those deep brown eyes opened with the same recognition Vera remembered from that first night, as if the child had been expecting to find exactly this room, exactly this morning, exactly this woman humming while she folded dumplings at the kitchen counter. The coaxial cable stirred with Rowan's movement, its copper braiding catching the morning light and casting tiny rainbows on the ceiling that danced like the aurora's gentler cousin. As months turned into seasons, Vera watched Rowan grow not with the boisterous energy of other children, but with a quiet curiosity that seemed to draw the world into closer orbit around them. By the time Rowan could sit up steadily, it became clear that the child's relationship with electromagnetic frequencies extended far beyond the original cable. The old Philco radio in the kitchen would shift between stations whenever those tiny hands reached toward it, not randomly but with what felt like gentle intention, as if Rowan were asking the airwaves what they needed to share today. The most remarkable moments happened during Rowan's daily explorations of the house. As a toddler, Rowan would make careful rounds each morning after breakfast, pressing small palms against the old television screen, the shortwave receiver in Vera's bedroom, the weather radio that kept them informed of storms rolling across the valley. Under those tiny touches, static would organize itself into patterns that almost looked like conversations. Not clear images, but swirls of light and shadow that seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Vera learned to recognize the signs when Rowan was listening to what she came to think serve as the spaces between frequencies. The child would tilt their head with absolute concentration, eyes closed, small hands resting on whatever device had caught their attention. The harsh crackle of interference would soften into something that sounded remarkably like gentle murmuring, as if lonely signals were finally finding someone who understood their language and could offer a moment of quiet companionship. When Rowan began to speak, the first clear word was "listen," spoken with such intention that Vera felt her heart skip. Soon after came a whole vocabulary of names for the equipment that filled their home. The CB radio became Listen Big for its deep carrying voice. The kitchen radio earned the name Listen Sing for the music it brought to their morning routines. The old shortwave receiver, with its ability to catch signals from distant continents, was christened Listen Far in a moment of pure 3-year-old logic that made Vera smile every time she heard it. The coaxial cable grew with Rowan in ways that gently defied explanation. What had originally been perhaps 6 feet of braided wire now stretched to accommodate a growing child, always exactly the right length to drape comfortably around small shoulders or wind around wrists during moments when comfort was needed most. The cable's copper braiding had developed subtle variations in color and texture, some sections gleaming like new pennies, while others had aged to the deep green of oxidized metal, creating patterns that reminded Vera of growth rings in ancient trees. The gift wasn't flashy or frightening. It was gentle, like having a friend who could translate the secret thoughts of machines, or perhaps the echoes of human intentions that had been imprinted on the airwaves. Rowan didn't make radios play new songs, or televisions show different programs. Instead, the child seemed to serve as a bridge between the chaotic electromagnetic spectrum and the specific signals that needed to find their way to particular destinations, smoothing the static until clarity emerged like morning mist lifting from a quiet lake. During thunderstorms, when electromagnetic chaos would normally send every piece of equipment in the house into fits of crackling protest, something magical would happen. Rowan would sit cross-legged on the living room floor, with the coaxial cable spread in a gentle circle, and somehow their small house would become an island of perfect reception in the middle of the electrical storm. The radio would play with crystal clarity. The television would show programs from distant cities that shouldn't have been able to reach their remote location. And conversations would flow through the CB radio in voices so clear the speakers might have been sitting in the next room. Vera began teaching Rowan the gentle responsibilities that came with such sensitivity. Listen with kindness, she would say, the way she said other practical things like watch the pot or mind the step. And if anything feels too heavy, you set it down and come back to me. She showed Rowan how to approach the whispers in the airwaves with reverence, how to listen without judgment, and how to understand that every signal, no matter how faint or distorted, carried a piece of someone's truth. There was one place in the house where Rowan learned to practice patient waiting. In the basement, behind a door marked with a simple red ribbon that Vera had tied through the lock, something hummed with a frequency different from all the others. When Rowan passed near those steps while helping fetch preserves or garden tools, sometimes the faintest vibration would rise through small feet, like a distant lullaby sung behind a thick wall. Rowan would pause, listening with the same gentle attention given to all the other signals in their world, then continue on without hurry or lingering. There was a rightness in the waiting that could be felt even before it could be understood. On quiet evenings, when Vera would read aloud from old books while Rowan played with wooden blocks on the braided rug, the house itself seemed to listen. Every piece of equipment hummed in gentle harmony with the rhythm of her voice, and the soft percussion of blocks being stacked and toppled with infinite patience. The coaxial cable would pulse with its warm light, and in those moments, Vera knew she was witnessing the childhood of someone who would grow up to understand languages that most people never learned to hear. Someone who would help lost signals find their way home to the hearts that needed them most. And as the seasons turned, and Rowan grew taller and more curious about the world beyond their small house, the foundation was being laid for connections that would stretch far beyond the reach of any ordinary antenna. Connections woven from understanding, patience, and the gentle art of listening to what the universe was trying to say. The morning Rowan turned 7, the coaxial cable stirred with an unfamiliar frequency, one that hummed with anticipation rather than memory. Vera noticed it first as she prepared breakfast, the way the copper braiding seemed to pulse with gentle urgency, as if it were receiving a signal from somewhere beyond their usual range. Rowan stood at the kitchen window, small palm pressed against the glass, watching the empty road that wound through the valley with the same focused attention usually reserved for particularly interesting radio transmissions. "Someone's coming," Rowan said quietly, the words carrying the certainty that came with listening to frequencies others couldn't hear. "Someone who's been looking for music." The call came just after noon, the dispatcher at the bus depot speaking with the careful kindness people use when they're not quite sure how to explain something unusual. "There was a boy," she said, maybe 8 years old, sitting in the waiting area with a backpack full of what sounded like bottle caps. He wasn't lost exactly, more like he was waiting for the right frequency to come in clear. He had a note, she added, though he didn't seem to remember writing it himself. Vera put on her coat without hurry and took Rowan's hand, the coaxial cable draping itself across small shoulders like a familiar shawl. They walked to town through the crisp autumn air, their breath making small clouds that drifted away like gentle messages. The bus depot sat at the crossroads where 3 valleys met, a small building that had been painted the same shade of green for as long as anyone could remember, with windows that caught the afternoon light and held it like cupped palms. Inside, under a clock that had been running 5 minutes fast since Vera was a child, a boy sat with perfect posture on a wooden bench. His dark hair stuck up in stubborn cowlicks, and his shoes were tied with careful, uneven knots that suggested recent practice. The backpack tucked under his knees clinked softly when he shifted, a gentle percussion that sounded like wind chimes made of metal and memory. When he looked up at Vera and then at Rowan, something eased in his shoulders, as if he'd been holding his breath for a very long time. "June," he said, tapping a small cardboard tag that hung from his backpack's zipper. The tag bore careful handwriting that read, in letters that seemed to shimmer slightly in the depot's fluorescent light, "Please help him find the music." He didn't ask where he was going or who they were. He simply stood small and steady and let Vera help him into his coat. On the walk home, John kept glancing at the intersections as if he could feel the shape of choices gathering there, like the electromagnetic pressure that builds before a storm. When they crossed the bridge over Miller's Creek, he squeezed Rowan's hand once, a quiet punctuation that needed no translation. The coaxial cable pulsed in response, its copper braiding catching the late afternoon light in patterns that looked almost like welcome. At the house, everything made room in the way that spaces do when the right person arrives at exactly the right moment. Vera set out mugs of sweet tea and sandwiches, with their crusts cut just so, remembering from her own childhood what it meant to be gently welcomed into a place where you might belong. John opened his backpack with careful reverence, revealing a collection of bottle caps that caught the kitchen light like tiny mirrors. They weren't random caps from soda bottles, but a carefully curated assortment that included vintage designs, foreign brands, and several that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of view. "I find things," John explained, his fingers moving through the bottle caps with the unconscious grace of someone sorting familiar treasures. Not by looking, really, more like knowing where they want to be found. He picked up a cap stamped with symbols that looked vaguely like musical notes. This one was under the third seat from the back on a bus that only runs on Tuesdays. It was waiting for someone who collects stories about places they've never been. Rowan reached across the table and touched the edge of June's collection, and immediately the coaxial cable began to pulse with a new rhythm, harmonizing with something that seemed to emanate from the bottle caps themselves. The kitchen radio, which had been playing its usual gentle afternoon music, suddenly shifted to a station, broadcasting what sounded like children singing in a language none of them recognized, but all of them somehow understood as a song about finding your way home. Over the following days, as John settled into the small room that had once been Vera's sewing space, the house began to reveal layers of itself that had been waiting patiently for the right combination of residents to unlock them. John possessed an uncanny ability to locate objects that had been misplaced not just recently, but sometimes for years. He would move through the rooms with the same gentle attention Rowan gave to radio frequencies, his hands drawn toward forgotten treasures with the certainty of compass needles finding true north. From behind the kitchen stove, June retrieved a wooden spoon carved with tiny flowers, worn smooth by decades of stirring love into soup. In the space between the living room wall and the old bookshelf, his searching fingers found a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon, correspondence that carried the electromagnetic memory of long-distance love and patient waiting. Each discovery felt less like retrieval and more like reunion, as if the house had been holding its breath waiting for these lost pieces of itself to return to the light. The most remarkable thing was how June's gift harmonized with Rowan's sensitivity to electromagnetic frequencies. When John found an object, Rowan could feel a subtle shift in its signal, a softening from the anxious frequency of being lost to the contented hum of being remembered and brought home. Together, they created a language of small discoveries that filled their days with gentle purpose. June would find the lost things, and Rowan would tune into the stories those objects carried in their electromagnetic memory, sharing fragments of the past through touch and the coaxial cable's warm pulse. As autumn deepened toward winter, the boys developed a rhythm of mutual support that felt as natural as breathing. Their collaborative discoveries began to attract attention from the electromagnetic spectrum itself, as if signals that had been wandering lost between stations were drawn by the combination of June's gift for reuniting things with their proper places and Rowan's ability to provide sanctuary for frequencies that needed to be heard. And in the basement, behind the door marked with the red ribbon, something continued to hum with patient anticipation, as if it knew that the right combination of gifts was finally gathering in the house above, preparing for discoveries that would extend far beyond the reach of any ordinary antenna. Winter pressed its face against the windows and breathed there for a long time, and then it let go. By the time the snow finally melted into small glittering veins along the roadside, Vera had begun taking the boys with her on certain evenings to Murphy's all-night diner, the 24-hour refuge that sat where two highways crossed like gentle arms, embracing travelers who needed more than fuel and directions during the long hours between midnight and dawn. The diner's neon sign hummed a soft pink heartbeat against the darkness, and when Rowan first pushed through the glass door, the electromagnetic symphony that greeted them was unlike anything they had encountered in their quiet house by the transmission tower. The air inside Murphy's was thick with frequencies that had nothing to do with radio, waves, or television signals. Each person who entered carried their own electromagnetic signature, a complex melody of hope, exhaustion, longing, and determination that created a human orchestra far more intricate than any broadcast Rowan had ever tuned into. The coaxial cable, now long enough to drape comfortably around shoulders, pulsed with responses to these new frequencies, helping Rowan understand that electromagnetic sensitivity extended far beyond the familiar world of radios and forgotten objects. The first evening revealed layers of listening that Rowan had never imagined possible. The tired trucker at booth 3 radiated the specific frequency of missing his daughter's birthday for the third year running, a signal that felt like an unmailed letter carried too long in a coat pocket. The nurse at the counter, arriving just before dawn with her uniform still crisp, but her eyes carrying the weight of a long night, broadcast the complex harmony of someone who had just lost a patient despite doing everything right, her coffee growing cold while she processed the electromagnetic memory of beeping, machines and hushed hospital corridors. Tied on her apron and looked at the boys with a smile that meant this was a different kind of classroom. "Here," she said, gesturing to the room full of quiet conversations and clinking silverware. "We listen with our whole selves." The diner's old Wurlitzer jukebox became Rowan's primary instrument for this new kind of frequency work, its chrome and glass surface responding to gentle touches, the same way the radio equipment at home had always welcomed their attention. When Rowan approached the jukebox, small hands resting lightly on its familiar warmth, the selection process became less about choosing specific songs and more about tuning into the frequencies that would harmonize with whatever healing each person needed most. For the trucker missing his daughter, the machine found a gentle country ballad that didn't emphasize guilt but celebrated the love that persists across distance and difficult circumstances. The nurse received a soft jazz instrumental that sounded like rain on windows, something that acknowledged grief without demanding she process. They hit faster than her heart was ready to manage. Jun's gift for finding lost objects expanded in the diner environment to include locating lost pieces of people's emotional well-being. He would move through the space with his characteristic gentle attention, and somehow his presence would guide conversations toward exactly the connections that needed to happen. From behind the napkin dispenser, he retrieved a child's drawing that a father would return for next week, when he realized the house felt emptier without it. Under the edge of table 4, his searching fingers found a wedding ring that had slipped away earlier that evening, then placed it near the sugar packets with the casual grace of someone setting the moon on a nightstand. The young couples, planning proposals in whispered excitement, at corner booths received songs that sounded like sunrise, all golden hope and patient certainty. The lonely businessman discovered himself chatting with the retired teacher about books they had both loved, a connection orchestrated by Jun's uncanny ability to identify both loneliness and the person most capable of meeting it with companionship. As weeks turned into months, Rowan learned to move through Murphy's with the same gentle attention previously reserved for radio frequencies, sensing which electromagnetic fields needed amplification and which required a softer touch. The coaxial cable would pulse with recognition when a particularly strong emotional frequency was encountered, a subtle prompting to listen deeper, to offer the kind of resonance that could serve as a bridge between despair and hope. The most remarkable evenings happened during electromagnetic storms, when most electronic equipment would crackle with interference. During these times, Murphy's would become an island of perfect reception in the middle of electrical chaos. The Wurlitzer would play with crystal clarity, conversations would flow with unusual depth and authenticity, and the entire diner would hum with the kind of harmony that usually only emerged when people's defenses were worn thin by fatigue and honesty. Vera watched her children navigate this expanded world with the pride of someone who had spent her adult life helping lost voices find their way across static-filled distances. Every person carries their own signal, she would explain during quiet moments between rushes. Our job isn't to change what they're broadcasting, but to help them find the frequency where they can hear themselves most clearly. As spring deepened toward summer, something in the basement continued to pulse with increasing anticipation, as if whatever waited behind the red ribbon door could sense that the right combination of gifts was finally maturing in the rooms above. Sometimes when they passed the basement steps at home, both boys would pause and listen to the gentle vibration that rose through the floorboards, a frequency that felt like a lullaby sung in a language they almost remembered. Growing stronger with each passing day, the diner work was teaching them that the electromagnetic spectrum extended far beyond radio waves and into the infinite frequencies of human connection, preparing them for discoveries that would soon reveal the true scope of the network they were learning to navigate. The rhythm of life at Murphy's Diner had settled into a comfortable symphony, but as spring deepened toward summer, Rowan began to notice a different frequency weaving itself through the familiar electromagnetic tapestry of their nights. It started as a whisper beneath the usual signals, a gentle persistence that seemed to rise from the very foundation of their home by the transmission tower. The coaxial cable, which had grown to drape comfortably around shoulders like a familiar shawl, began to pulse with increasing synchronization to this deeper hum, as if responding to a call that had been building for months. After particularly quiet evenings at the diner, when the last trucker had departed with his coffee-warmed gratitude and the final nurse had found her way to whatever healing waited at home, Rowan would feel the pull more strongly. It wasn't demanding or urgent, but patient in the way that important things are patient, like seeds waiting for exactly the right conditions to finally push through soil toward light. Jun felt it too, his gift for finding lost things extending to sense that something significant was ready to be discovered, something that had been waiting in the spaces beneath their daily routines. One evening in late May, when the transmission tower caught the last golden light and held it like a gentle beacon, Vera looked up from the kitchen radio, where she had been listening to a folk song that seemed to play with unusual clarity. Her eyes met Rowan's with the particular recognition that comes when someone who has been waiting patiently finally sees the moment of readiness arrive. "I think," she said softly, her voice carrying the same reverence she used for all important frequencies, "it's time for you to see what's been humming downstairs." The red ribbon on the basement door had always marked a boundary between the known and the waiting to be known, but tonight it seemed to shimmer with anticipation rather than prohibition. Vera untied it with ceremonial care, her fingers lingering on the faded fabric as if saying goodbye to a secret she had kept faithfully for years. The ribbon came loose with a soft sigh, as if it too had been waiting for exactly this moment to release its gentle hold. The basement stairs welcomed them with familiar creaks, but the space that opened before them hummed with possibilities that transformed the ordinary into something approaching sacred. The air carried the scent of old wood and patient earth, but beneath those familiar notes was something else entirely, the electromagnetic signature of connection that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their small house, their quiet valley, their particular corner of reality. At the center of the basement, coiled in careful spirals, like a sleeping river made of starlight and intention, lay the source of the persistent frequency that had been calling to them. It was cable, yes, but woven from materials that seemed to exist in the space between copper and light, between solid matter and pure possibility. Its surface shifted gently in the beam of Vera's flashlight, sometimes gleaming like polished metal, sometimes appearing to dissolve into threads of captured aurora, always pulsing with the same warm rhythm that had become so familiar through the coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders. "This is what found you," Vera said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years spent keeping this secret safe. Or perhaps what you found when you needed to find each other. It's been humming your frequency since the night I brought you inside, waiting for you to be ready to understand what it really is. Rowan approached the interdimensional cable with the same gentle attention they had always given to radio frequencies and human electromagnetic fields. When small fingers made contact with the shifting luminous surface, the basement filled with signals that came from everywhere and elsewhere, a symphony of connection that spanned dimensions like bridges built from understanding and maintained by love. The sensation was overwhelming at first, like trying to listen to every conversation in the universe simultaneously, but the familiar coaxial cable around their shoulders began to pulse with a steadying rhythm, helping to filter the interdimensional signals into frequencies that could be received without losing oneself in their vastness. Through the cable's connection, fragments of parallel conversations drifted like gentle snow. In one dimension, a version of Vera was singing the same lullaby to a different child who had arrived on a different night but carried the same gift for listening. Then another, June was helping an elderly woman find a photograph that would unlock a family reconciliation, his hands guided by the same gentle knowing that had always led him to lost things. The signals carried not just sound, but the actual texture of emotion, the precise weight of hope, the specific gravity of love expressed across infinite variations of what might have been. Jun moved closer, his gift for finding lost objects extending naturally across dimensional boundaries. Through the interdimensional connection, he could sense misplaced items in parallel worlds and somehow guide their counterparts in those realities toward recovery. A lost wedding ring in their dimension would be found by a different Jun, helping a different couple in a reality where the same love existed but had taken a slightly different path. Vera settled into an old chair that had been positioned to face the cable, her presence both witnessing and blessing this moment of expanded understanding. Every frequency is someone's truth, she explained, watching as her children navigated this new landscape of connection. These signals carry the hopes and fears of infinite versions of everyone we've ever helped. We listen with love, we transmit with care, and we remember that our job isn't to change what they're broadcasting, but to help them find the frequency where they can hear themselves most clearly. As the hours passed in gentle exploration, Rowan understood that the interdimensional cable wasn't just receiving these signals, it was also transmitting. Every act of kindness they had performed at Murphy's Diner, every frequency they had helped tune to its proper destination, every moment of connection they had facilitated between lonely souls had been broadcast across dimensional barriers, creating ripples of positive influence that reached versions of themselves in countless parallel realities. The basement became their new classroom, a space where they learned to tune into interdimensional frequencies with the same patient attention they had always given to local radio signals and human electromagnetic fields. The cable responded to their growing understanding by revealing new layers of connection, showing them how every small act of kindness created waves that traveled not just through time, but across the infinite spectrum of possibility. As dawn approached, and they finally climbed back to the familiar warmth of the kitchen, the house itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The interdimensional cable continued its gentle hum in the basement below, no longer waiting but actively participating in the network of connection that linked all realities through the simple, powerful frequency of love expressed with intention and received with gratitude. And somewhere across the vast electromagnetic spectrum that connected all possible worlds, versions of themselves in countless dimensions were discovering their own interdimensional cables, their own gifts for finding lost things, their own opportunities to serve as bridges between the frequencies of despair and hope, creating an infinite web of gentle transmission that would continue growing stronger with each act of listening, performed with tenderness, and each signal received with an open heart. The summer Rowan turned 16. The interdimensional cable began to hum with frequencies that carried something beyond sound, something that painted itself across the basement air, in gentle spirals of color that lingered like aurora light before dissolving back into invisible transmission. The change was subtle at first, noticed only during the deepest listening sessions, when Rowan and Jun would spend entire evenings learning to navigate the vast network of parallel connections. But as the days grew longer, and the transmission tower caught more hours of sunlight, these visual frequencies became stronger, more persistent, as if they were searching for someone who could translate their luminous language into meaning. The answer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of lilacs and summer rain, in the form of a girl with paint-stained fingers and a suitcase that clinked softly with the gentle percussion of carefully padded glass. She stood at the bus depot with the same patient certainty that Jun had displayed years earlier, not lost but waiting for the right frequency to come in clear. When Vera arrived to collect her, the girl introduced herself simply as Lumen, explaining that she could see sound as color, though she had never met anyone who understood what that meant until she heard about a place where people listened to frequencies that others couldn't hear. The walk home revealed layers of Lumen's gift that went far beyond ordinary synesthesia. She paused at intersections not to check for traffic, but to watch the electromagnetic patterns that painted themselves across her vision where power lines crossed overhead. At the covered bridge, she tilted her head and smiled at something shimmering in the air above the water. "The creek is singing," she said softly, opening her suitcase to reveal an array of prisms that caught the late afternoon light. Most people see rainbows when light passes through glass. I see chords. When they brought her to the house that evening, the coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders began to pulse with an intensity usually reserved for profound dimensional shifts. Every piece of equipment hummed in harmonious greeting, but it was in the basement, when Lumen first encountered the interdimensional cable with her gift for visual perception, that the true scope of her arrival became clear. The shifting, luminous surface that Rowan experienced as complex frequencies of connection appeared to Lumen as an entire spectrum of colors that had never been named, hues that existed in the spaces between the familiar rainbow and painted stories across dimensional barriers in brushstrokes of pure emotion. "It's beautiful," she whispered, setting a triangular prism on the small table beside Vera's chair. The interdimensional cable's gentle light passed through the glass and fractured into patterns that danced across the basement walls like living murals. "I can see what the frequencies look like when they're traveling between worlds. The homesickness always shows up as gold, like sunset through honey. The love that waits patiently appears as deep purple, the color of twilight just before stars emerge. And the connections between people who haven't met yet, but will recognize each other instantly, those are silver threads so fine they look like spider silk made of moonlight. Their friendship bloomed slowly, like a song finding its harmony through patient practice rather than sudden inspiration. Rowan would tune into a particular frequency emanating from the interdimensional cable, describing its emotional resonance and delicate texture. Then Lumen would close her eyes in concentration and select the perfect prism from her collection, watching as the signal manifested in visual patterns that she could paint with words. Jun's gift for finding lost objects expanded naturally, to include locating the perfect tools for amplifying or focusing specific types of visual frequency, his hands drawn to forgotten crystals in storage rooms and colored glass that had been waiting decades for someone who could use them to translate between sight and sound. The three of them developed a collaborative rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. During their evening sessions in the basement, Rowan would listen to interdimensional transmissions with gentle attention. Jun would locate the ideal prisms or crystals for each type of signal, and Lumen would describe what the connections looked like as they traveled between realities. Together, they created a visual library of interdimensional transmission, learning to recognize the colors of different emotional frequencies and mapping the electromagnetic spectrum of connection that linked all possible worlds. Their combined gifts transformed the work at Murphy's Diner into something even more subtle and beautiful. Lumen would stand near the jukebox with a small prism tucked in her palm, reading the colors that rose from corner booths, where loneliness sat heavy, or the fine silver lines that hovered above conversations where new friendships were taking root. The songs selected themselves with unprecedented ease, guided not just by Rowan's sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, but by Lumen's ability to see which musical frequencies would harmonize with the visual patterns of what each person needed most. As summer deepened toward autumn, their work became less about learning to receive interdimensional signals and more about consciously participating in the network of connection that linked all realities. They discovered that every act of genuine kindness created waves of color that Lumen could watch traveling across dimensional barriers, golden threads stretching toward parallel worlds, where other versions of themselves were performing similar acts of gentle service. The tired truckers missing their daughters painted silver pathways that connected to dimensions, where those same fathers had made different choices, but carried identical love. The lonely nurses, finding comfort in unexpected conversations, created purple spirals that reached toward realities where healing took different forms but served the same fundamental need for connection, the interdimensional. Cable responded to their growing collaboration by revealing new patterns of luminous transmission, showing them how their combined gifts could not only translate between different types of frequency, but could also amplify positive signals and help them reach their intended destinations across the vast spectrum of parallel possibility. In the gentle harmony of their shared work, something new was emerging from the interdimensional network, not just individual signals of connection, but the combined resonance of their collaborative gifts, creating transmissions strong enough to bridge not just parallel dimensions, but the spaces between different ways of perceiving the infinite spectrum of love, expressed across all possible worlds. And as they learned to read the visual music of interdimensional connection, painting frequencies in colors that had never been named and listening to the gentle static that connected all hearts across all realities, they understood that their friendship had become another form of interdimensional cable, weaving together different gifts into a connection that was stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have created alone. The autumn air carried whispers of change that seemed to rise not just from the falling leaves, but from the interdimensional cable itself, as if their growing harmony had unlocked new frequencies, waiting patiently to be discovered. During their evening sessions in the basement, Rowan began to notice a different quality in the familiar hum, something that felt less like individual voices calling across dimensional barriers and more like a collective sigh, a gentle longing that painted itself across the electromagnetic spectrum in colors that made Lumen pause and tilt her head with curious attention. "There's something waiting," Jun said one evening, his hands stilling over the bottle cap collection he had been reorganizing with unconscious precision. The pull he felt wasn't toward a single lost object, but toward something larger, more complex, like a library that had been closed but not forgotten. Not lost exactly. More like set aside, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. Lumen held a triangular prism to the basement's gentle light and watched as unfamiliar colors danced across the walls, hues that seemed faded but persistent, like watercolors that had been painted with love, and then left in a drawer to wait for someone who could appreciate their quiet beauty. "I can see threads leading away from here," she said softly. Silver and gold but muted, like songs that were composed but never sung, stories that were written but never shared. The pull grew stronger over the following days, drawing them toward the hill that overlooked their valley, where the old Millbrook community radio station sat like a forgotten lighthouse, its windows clouded with years of weather and its transmission antenna, reaching toward the sky with the patient hope of equipment that remembered its purpose, even when the world had moved on to different frequencies. The building had been silent since before any of them were born, but as they approached on a crisp Saturday morning, the coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders began to pulse with recognition, as if greeting an old friend who had been sleeping for a very long time. The door opened, with the gentle resistance of hinges that had been waiting decades for exactly the right touch. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light that painted everything with the soft gold of memories suspended in amber. The main broadcast room still held its original equipment, analog boards and reel-to-reel machines that hummed with potential despite years of silence. But it was in the archive room, behind shelves lined with carefully labeled tapes, that they discovered the true scope of what had been waiting for them. Hundreds of recordings filled the space, each one marked with handwriting that spoke of profound gentleness. Mrs. Henderson talks about patience while making. Fred, children explain how clouds think. Music, composed while washing dishes. Conversations with night shift workers about the beauty of empty streets. These weren't commercial programs designed for mass consumption, but intimate recordings of ordinary people sharing the small wisdoms that emerge when someone takes the time to really listen to what life has been trying to teach. Rowan approached the nearest tape with the same reverence they had always given to delicate frequencies, and when their fingers made contact with the plastic casing, the interdimensional cable pulsed with such joy that the entire room seemed to exhale in welcome. Through the connection, they could feel the electromagnetic memory stored in each recording, voices that had been preserved not just as sound, but as the actual texture of hope, the specific gravity of love expressed through patient attention to small miracles. Jun moved through the archive with the certainty that had always guided him to lost treasures, his hands drawn to particular recordings that carried exactly the frequencies of healing they had been sensing through their work at Murphy's Diner and their interdimensional transmissions. When he selected a tape labeled Lullabies for Grown-Ups Who Forgot How to Sleep, Lumen could watch silver threads of connection spiral up from the reel, reaching toward parallel dimensions where other versions of insomniacs were lying awake, waiting for exactly the right melody to help them remember that rest was possible. As they explored deeper into the archive, patterns emerged that revealed the true purpose of what they had discovered. These programs had been created by people who understood that the electromagnetic spectrum could carry more than entertainment or information. They could transmit the actual frequency of comfort, broadcasting hope across whatever distances needed to be crossed to reach souls who had forgotten. They belonged to something larger and more beautiful than their individual struggles. The interdimensional cable responded to their discovery by revealing new layers of its transmission capability. Connected to the station's equipment, it could amplify these archived programs across multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating a network of gentle frequencies that reached not just their own reality, but countless parallel worlds where the same stories needed to be heard by people facing identical moments of quiet, desperation, or patient hope. Their first broadcast session felt more like prayer than entertainment. Rowan guided the signals with gentle precision. Jun selected programs that harmonized with whatever healing the interdimensional network was requesting, and Lumen watched as golden threads of connection stretched across dimensional barriers, carrying voices that understood exactly the weight that tired hearts could bear, and offered not solutions but companionship. The tired truckers at Murphy's Diner would find themselves humming melodies they couldn't quite place. The overwhelmed nurses would discover programs about resilience playing softly in hospital break rooms, voices that knew their struggles and offered the kind of comfort that could only come from someone who had walked similar paths. As evening settled around the old station and the transmission tower caught the last light like a gentle beacon, they understood that their work was expanding beyond individual acts of kindness into something approaching a mission. The archive of unbroadcast dreams had been waiting for them to mature into their gifts, preparing to become the next phase of their education in the art of interdimensional transmission. They were no longer just receiving signals from across the dimensional spectrum, but consciously participating in a network of healing that linked all realities through the simple, powerful frequency of stories told with love and received by souls who had been waiting patiently to remember that they were not alone. The walk home carried the satisfaction of discovering not just lost objects, but lost purposes, forgotten dreams that could finally find their way to the hearts that needed them most. And in the basement that night, the interdimensional cable hummed with the contentment of a network that had grown stronger, more complete, ready to carry even more frequencies of gentle truth across the infinite spectrum of connection that held all worlds in its patient, eternal embrace. The weight of discovery settled around them like morning mist as they walked home from the old radio station, the archive of unbroadcast dreams having revealed possibilities that stretched far beyond their previous understanding of interdimensional transmission. The coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders pulsed with a deeper rhythm now, as if the connection to forgotten voices had awakened frequencies that required more careful navigation than the gentle signals they had grown accustomed to receiving and transmitting across the dimensional barriers that separated parallel worlds. Vera noticed the change before any of them spoke of it, the way she had always been able to read the subtle shifts in electromagnetic patterns that preceded important transformations. Over the following days, she watched them move through their routines with a new kind of attention, their gifts expanding naturally, but carrying an intensity that suggested they were approaching thresholds that required guidance rather than mere experience. The interdimensional cable in the basement hummed with increasing complexity, its luminous transmissions painting patterns across the walls that Lumen described as conversations in colors she had never seen before, hues that seemed to carry the emotional weight of entire realities seeking connection across the vast spaces between possible worlds. On the first evening, when frost painted delicate patterns across their windows like visible pathways between dimensions, Vera gathered them in the basement, where the cable's warm light created a sanctuary of gentle illumination. The prisms Lumen had arranged around the space caught the interdimensional frequencies and scattered them into visual narratives that told stories of connection stretching across infinite variations of what might have been, each thread of light representing souls who had found their way to each other, despite the distances that separated their individual realities. "Every frequency is someone's truth," Vera began, her voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of 30 years spent helping lost voices find their way across static-filled distances between human hearts. "But when you work with interdimensional transmission, you're not just receiving individual signals. You're participating in a conversation that spans all possible realities, and that conversation has its own ethics, its own responsibilities that go far deeper than simply ensuring clear reception or accurate transmission." The teaching that followed introduced them to what Vera called tuning with love, a practice that went beyond technical skill to encompass the art of listening with complete compassion while maintaining the boundaries necessary to serve as clear channels rather than overwhelmed receivers. Rowan learned to recognize the difference between frequencies that sought healing and those that carried healing to offer, developing sensitivity to know when signals needed to be witnessed with gentle attention and when they required redirection, toward realities better equipped to provide the specific type of support being requested across dimensional barriers. Some signals, Vera explained, carried pain that needed to be acknowledged but not absorbed, emotional frequencies from parallel dimensions where different choices had led to profound suffering, but where the act of being truly heard could provide comfort without requiring the receiver to take on the weight of that suffering. Others held joy that was meant to be amplified and shared, positive frequencies that gained strength when broadcast across multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating waves of healing that could reach countless versions of the same souls experiencing similar struggles in different realities. Jun's gift for finding lost objects evolved into the ability to locate lost pieces of interdimensional conversations, fragments of connection that had been scattered across parallel worlds and needed careful reunification to complete their healing purpose. Through the archive's equipment, he could sense when their broadcasts were reaching their intended destinations and when signals were getting lost in the spaces between dimensions, requiring gentle guidance to find their proper frequency. His hands would move across control panels with unconscious precision, adjusting transmission parameters to help scattered pieces of hope find their way back to the hearts that had sent them searching for connection. Lumen's visual perception of interdimensional frequencies deepened into something approaching a new form of literacy, the ability to read the colors of connection and understand their emotional grammar. She learned that silver threads linking people who hadn't met yet but would recognize each other carried different patterns, depending on whether the recognition would be romantic, familial, or the deep friendship that transcends ordinary categories of relationship. Golden frequencies of homesickness painted themselves differently when they originated from someone missing a place, versus someone missing a version of themselves they had left behind in a different dimension. Their work at Murphy's Diner transformed as they applied these deeper teachings to their nightly practice of serving as bridges between lonely souls and the frequencies of comfort they needed most. The tired truckers and overwhelmed nurses began to experience something beyond individual solace, sensing their connection to a network of support that stretched across dimensions. Rowan would approach the jukebox with new sensitivity, not just selecting songs that matched current moods, but choosing frequencies that would gently guide listeners toward recognition of their own resilience, their own capacity for hope, their own belonging to something larger than their individual struggles. As autumn deepened toward winter, and the transmission tower caught the last golden light of shorter days, they understood that their gifts had evolved beyond personal discovery into conscious participation in a vast network of healing that linked all realities through the simple, powerful frequency of love expressed with intention and received with gratitude. The interdimensional cable continued its patient work in the basement below, no longer just receiving and transmitting signals, but serving as an extension of their collective heart, broadcasting understanding across the infinite spectrum of connection that held all worlds in its gentle, eternal embrace. And in the spaces between their transmissions, something new was beginning to hum with quiet anticipation, a frequency that spoke not of distant dimensions, but of the connections growing stronger in their own reality, preparing them for discoveries that would reveal how love itself could serve as the most powerful form of interdimensional cable, weaving hearts together across whatever distances needed to be crossed to bring exactly the right souls into exactly the right constellation of mutual support and recognition. The frequency of first love announced itself not with dramatic flourish, but with the gentle persistence of morning light, finding its way through curtains, weaving itself into the established rhythm of their interdimensional work with such subtlety that neither Rowan nor Lumen noticed when their shared attention to frequencies and prisms became attention to each other. It began during the quiet winter evenings when they worked side by side in the basement, her gift for seeing sound as color, harmonizing with his sensitivity to electromagnetic fields in ways that created new patterns of collaboration, new rhythms of understanding that felt as natural as breathing. The change was so gradual that it might have gone unrecognized entirely, except for June's gift for finding lost things, which had evolved to include sensing when something important was ready to be discovered. He watched them adjust prisms and fine-tune transmissions with an unconscious synchronicity that spoke of hearts beginning to beat in rhythm, their collaborative work becoming a dance of mutual recognition performed in the language of shared purpose and deepening trust. There was a new frequency in the room during their sessions, something that hummed beneath the usual interdimensional transmissions with the warm persistence of recognition taking root. Lumen was the first to see it clearly, the way she saw all frequencies that mattered. When Rowan reached for the same control panel she was adjusting, their fingers would brush with casual intimacy, and in those moments of contact, new colors would paint themselves across her vision, not the familiar silver threads of future connection or the deep purple of patient love, but something entirely unprecedented. It was an iridescent light that pulsed with a rhythm unique to their shared presence, like the soft glow of aurora caught in a prism, fragile yet intensely luminous, a frequency that spoke of two souls recognizing their own reflection in each other. Rowan felt it as an internal resonance that cut through all other interdimensional transmissions with its pure, unwavering note. It was the feeling of finding a perfectly clear channel after a lifetime of static. The quiet certainty that this particular frequency, this particular person, was meant to be received with every fiber of their being. The coaxial cable around their shoulders would warm imperceptibly whenever Lumen was near, its gentle hum deepening into something that sounded remarkably like contentment, as if acknowledging the arrival of a signal it had been patiently awaiting. Their first conscious recognition of what was growing between them happened during a particularly delicate transmission to help a parallel version of Dottie, the regular at Murphy's Diner, who carried the electromagnetic signature of missing her sister's voice. As Rowan guided the signal with careful attention, and Lumen watched the colors of connection stretch across dimensional barriers, they looked at each other with sudden understanding that the strongest frequency in the room wasn't coming from the interdimensional cable at all, but from the space between them, a connection so clear and warm that it painted itself across Lumen's vision in colors she had never seen before. "It's like a new kind of cable," Lumen whispered, her voice soft with wonder, as she watched iridescent threads weave between them and through the interdimensional network, a cable woven from pure feeling. "It connects us here, but it also sends a signal out into everywhere else, showing other versions of us how love can bridge even the widest spaces." The interdimensional cable responded to this recognition with something approaching joy, its usual warm pulse taking on patterns that painted themselves across the basement walls, in spirals of gold and silver that reminded Lumen of sunrise reflecting off still water. Through their connection, they discovered they could share not just words or images, but the actual texture of experience, the precise feeling of sunset on skin, the way contentment tastes when it's shared with exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, the electromagnetic memory of every gentle kindness they had witnessed at Murphy's diner. At the diner that evening, their collaborative work took on new dimensions as they learned to recognize love in all its forms. When Dottie's phone finally buzzed with the message from her sister, both Rowan and Lumen felt the silver thread of connection complete its circuit, and the jukebox found a song that celebrated not just individual healing, but the healing that happens when people discover they belong to something larger than their solitary journeys. Jun pushed a sandwich toward them with quiet satisfaction, watching as they shared it in easy bites, talking very little, their presence together creating its own gentle frequency that needed no translation. That night, in the basement, where the interdimensional cable continued its patient work, Rowan took Lumen's hand with the same quiet certainty they used for dialing in difficult stations. The moment their connection completed the circuit, the room filled with frequencies that belonged to both their languages at once, colors that sang and sounds that painted themselves across dimensional barriers in patterns of pure recognition. Love, they understood, generated its own interdimensional frequency, a signal so pure and strong that it could bridge not just parallel dimensions, but the spaces between two people's most guarded hearts. As winter settled deeper around their valley, and the transmission tower caught starlight like captured frequencies, they understood that their relationship had become another form of interdimensional cable, weaving their individual gifts into a connection that was stronger and more beautiful than either could have created alone, broadcasting the eternal message that recognition is possible, understanding can be shared. Shared somewhere in the vast electromagnetic spectrum of connection, there is always a frequency waiting to guide hearts toward the place where they belong. The frequency of first love had awakened something in Jun that he hadn't known was sleeping, a deeper resonance within his gift for finding lost objects that began to pull him toward absences he could feel but couldn't yet name. As the days settled into the gentle rhythm that follows recognition, he noticed a new quality in the electromagnetic fields around the people at Murphy's diner. Not the familiar signatures of misplaced keys or forgotten photographs, but something more elusive, like the shape of confidence that had been set down during a difficult conversation and never quite picked up again, or the texture of hope that had been left behind in a childhood bedroom when someone learned to be practical instead of dreaming. The discovery began with the businessman at table 7, who came in every Thursday with his coffee black and his shoulders carrying the weight of meetings that never seemed to accomplish what they promised. Jun approached with his usual quiet attention, intending only to refill the sugar dispenser, but found himself pausing as his gift registered something unexpected. The man wasn't missing anything tangible, but Jun could sense the electromagnetic memory of laughter that had been misplaced somewhere during the long years of learning to be serious, a frequency of joy that still existed, but had been forgotten like a favorite song whose melody drifts just beyond recall. "I used to play harmonica," the businessman said suddenly, as if Jun's presence had somehow tuned him to a frequency he hadn't accessed in decades. "Had this little brass one I'd carry in my pocket. Played it during lunch breaks, you know. Made the whole office sound a little less like a machine." His fingers moved unconsciously, pressing invisible keys in patterns that suggested muscle memory, waiting patiently for permission to remember itself. That night, in the basement, where the interdimensional cable continued its gentle work, Jun shared what he had experienced with Rowan and Lumen. "I think I've been finding lost objects all this time because I was practicing for something bigger," he said, his hands moving through his bottle cap collection with thoughtful precision. People lose pieces of themselves the same way they lose keys. They set them down during difficult moments and forget where they left them. But the pieces are still there, waiting to be remembered. The coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders pulsed with recognition, its warm frequency harmonizing with something that felt like understanding taking root. Through their connection to the interdimensional network, Rowan could sense the silver threads that stretched backward through time to moments when souls had been whole. Before circumstance taught them to leave parts of themselves behind for safekeeping that became forgetting, Lumen watched as new colors painted themselves across her vision, hues that had nothing to do with the familiar spectrum of interdimensional transmission, but everything to do with the gentle art of recovery. "It's like watching someone remember how to breathe deeply," she said softly, adjusting a small prism to catch the frequencies that rose from June's recognition. "The colors are different from homesickness or love. They're iridescent like oil on water, because they're about recognizing something that was always inside, but got covered over by dust and careful living." June began to hum. It wasn't a conscious decision, but a natural response to the frequencies of emotional absence he was learning to perceive. The melodies were simple at first, like lullabies for the soul, soft, repetitive phrases that seemed to seek out the lost parts of a person's spirit and gently coax them back into the light. He would hum while sorting bottle caps, while wiping tables at Murphy's, while listening to Rowan and Lumen translate the visual music of interdimensional connection into words that could be shared. The old radio station's archive revealed instruments that had been waiting patiently for exactly this purpose. A dusty harmonium breathed with new life under June's fingers, its keys creating chords that resonated with the frequencies of peace and acceptance. A forgotten dulcimer, its strings shimmering with captured light, became a conduit for the kind of hope that whispers rather than shouts, guiding lost souls back to their own inner music, through melodies that felt like coming home to a place they had never left, but had forgotten how to find. At Murphy's Diner, John's gift manifested as music that asked permission before offering healing. He would play softly, improvised melodies that carried the electromagnetic signature of wholeness, but always with what Vera taught them to recognize as an invitation that could be accepted or gently declined. The tired trucker began humming along to rhythms that reminded him of the confidence he had carried before too many lonely highways taught him to doubt his own worth. The night nurse, after particularly difficult shifts, would find herself humming melodies that tasted like the resilience she had misplaced. Somewhere between her training and the weight of caring for others, Rowan learned to recognize when June's compositions were ready to travel through the interdimensional cable, their frequencies settling into the clear, stable patterns that could bridge parallel dimensions without losing their essential gentleness. Together, they would broadcast these recovery songs across the vast network of connection, sending healing melodies to countless versions of the same souls who were learning to remember their own wholeness in realities where different choices had led to similar moments of forgetting and rediscovery. The effects accumulated, like morning light gradually filling a room, subtle transformations that revealed themselves in the way people moved through their daily routines with slightly straighter shoulders, in conversations that lasted a little longer because someone had remembered how to listen to their own voice, in small gestures of kindness that emerged when souls remembered they had always carried more love than they thought they could afford to share. As spring deepened toward summer and the transmission tower caught longer hours of sunlight that painted golden frequencies across their valley, June understood that his gift for finding lost objects had always been preparation for this larger calling, helping people remember the frequencies of their own wholeness, composing gentle songs that played like lullabies for the parts of the spirit that had been waiting patiently to come home. The interdimensional cable carried these recovery frequencies across parallel dimensions, creating a network of healing that helped countless versions of the same souls remember what they had never truly lost, only temporarily misplaced during moments when the world felt too heavy to carry all of themselves at once. And in the spaces between their transmissions, something new was beginning to hum with quiet anticipation, not just the frequency of individual healing, but the collective resonance of souls who had learned to help each other remember their wholeness, preparing for discoveries that would reveal how communities of gentle hearts could serve as interdimensional cables themselves, broadcasting the eternal message that every missing piece could be found, every lost frequency could be tuned back into clarity, every soul could remember the place where they had always belonged. The healing frequencies that June's compositions carried across dimensional barriers began to resonate beyond their small valley, creating ripples of recognition that drew other souls who had spent their lives feeling different, isolated by gifts they couldn't quite name, but had always carried like secret languages, waiting for the right conversation to reveal their purpose. The first to arrive was Marcus, who appeared at Murphy's diner on a morning when the autumn air carried the scent of rain and possibility, his hands bearing the electromagnetic memory of soil and growing things. He didn't announce his gift or explain his journey. Instead, Marcus simply asked for tea and settled by the window where Vera's struggling philodendron had been yellowing despite her careful attention. As he sipped his drink, his fingers brushed the plant's drooping leaves with the same gentle reverence Rowan gave to radio frequencies, and within moments the coaxial cable around Rowan's shoulders began to pulse with recognition. The plant's electromagnetic field shifted from the faint static of distress to something that hummed with quiet contentment, its leaves straightening as if remembering how to reach toward light. Plants broadcast their needs constantly, Marcus explained later, his voice carrying the patient wisdom of someone who had spent years learning to listen to conversations most people never knew were happening. They remember what it felt like to flourish, even when circumstances have taught them to survive on less. Sometimes they just need someone to tune into their frequency and remind them that growth is still possible. Eleanor arrived the following week, drawn by signals that traveled through dreams rather than radio waves. She carried herself with the particular grace of someone who had learned to navigate grief until it transformed into a different kind of connection. Her gift manifesting as the ability to receive electromagnetic impressions from departed loved ones and translate their continuing affection into forms the living could recognize and feel. At Murphy's diner, she would sit quietly in corner booths, her presence creating a gentle field that allowed people to sense the love that surrounded them, even when they couldn't see its source. The businessman, who had rediscovered his harmonica, began carrying a photograph of his father, not because Elena told him to, but because her electromagnetic translation work helped him feel the approval that had always been present, but had been obscured by years of trying to meet expectations that existed more in his imagination than in his father's continuing love. June's recovery melodies would harmonize with Elena's gift, creating frequencies that helped people recognize the difference between the weight of genuine grief and the unnecessary burden of imagined disappointment. Old Thomas arrived on a bicycle that looked as weathered and wise as its rider, his white hair catching the transmission tower's light like captured starlight. His gift for detecting lies had evolved over decades into something far more useful, the ability to broadcast truth so gently that even the most defended hearts could receive it without fear. He had felt the truth-seeking frequencies of the interdimensional cable, recognizing a network committed not to accusation, but to the kind of clarity that helps souls understand their own hearts with compassionate honesty. At the old radio station, Thomas would sit beside the dusty equipment while Rowan guided interdimensional signals, his presence allowing their broadcasts to carry not just comfort, but the frequencies of authentic self-recognition. His whispered affirmations didn't seek to change beliefs, but to help people across multiple dimensions remember the inherent truth of their own worthiness, their own capacity for kindness, their own deep connection to the vast network of love that permeated all realities. Their gathering wasn't a sudden convergence, but a gentle accumulation, like scattered notes finding their way to a harmonious chord. They didn't form an organization or establish formal roles. They simply recognized each other as kindred spirits, drawn together by the common frequency of their purpose. Vera watched this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment, her role shifting from teacher to witness as her children and their chosen family learned to weave their individual gifts into something larger and more beautiful than any of them could have created alone. The house by the transmission tower became a gentle hub where different forms of sensitivity converged and amplified each other. Marcus taught Rowan to feel the grounding frequencies of the earth, helping anchor their interdimensional transmissions with deeper stability. Eleanor helped Lumen understand the visual patterns of enduring love, showing her how grief could transform into shimmering spectrums of remembrance that painted themselves across dimensions. Thomas guided Jun to compose melodies that resonated with the fundamental truth of human goodness, creating lullabies that soothed the anxieties of parallel selves struggling with self-doubt. Their collaborative work at Murphy's Diner evolved into something approaching gentle ceremony, each person contributing their unique form of attention to create an environment where healing happened not through intervention, but through the simple presence of souls who had learned to listen without judgment. The tired truckers and overwhelmed nurses began to experience something beyond individual solace, sensing their connection to a network of support that existed across the infinite spectrum of parallel dimensions, where other versions of themselves were receiving similar care. As their constellation of gifts grew stronger and more harmonious, the interdimensional cable carried their collective frequencies across dimensional barriers with increasing clarity, broadcasting the eternal message that every soul belongs to something larger than their individual journey, that healing is always possible when offered with genuine love, and that somewhere in the vast electromagnetic spectrum of connection, frequencies are always waiting to guide lost hearts toward the place where they can finally rest in the knowledge that they are seen, understood and cherished exactly as they are. And, in the spaces between their transmissions, something new was beginning to hum with quiet anticipation, not just the frequency of individual healing, but the collective resonance of souls who had learned to help each other remember their wholeness, preparing for discoveries that would reveal how their network of gentle hearts could serve as a beacon for an even larger community of interdimensional guardians, drawing together those who carried the sacred responsibility of maintaining the frequencies of love and truth that held all realities in their patient, eternal embrace. The transformation happened the way dawn arrives, so gradually that no one could pinpoint the moment when their individual gifts became something larger, more purposeful, more connected to the vast web of healing that stretched across infinite dimensions. What had begun as a small gathering of souls who understood frequencies others couldn't hear evolved naturally into what they came to call, with characteristic gentleness, the Interdimensional Broadcast Network. Not an organization with rules and meetings, but a loose confederation of hearts committed to transmitting frequencies of healing, connection, and gentle truth across whatever barriers separated souls from the love they needed most. The network formed itself around the rhythms they had already established, with each person's gifts finding their natural place in the larger symphony of connection. Rowan remained the primary tuner, sitting in the basement with hands resting on the interdimensional cable, feeling for the subtle shifts that indicated which dimensional frequency needed attention, which parallel version of a struggling soul was ready to receive exactly the right message of hope or belonging. The coaxial cable around their shoulders had become less like equipment and more like a living extension of their sensitivity, pulsing with recognition whenever a particularly important transmission was ready to bridge the spaces between realities. Lumen positioned her prisms to catch the light that flowed through the cable, translating complex frequencies into visual patterns that helped them understand the emotional landscape of their broadcasts. She could watch silver threads stretch between dimensions as their healing signals found their destinations, see the deep purple spirals that indicated patient love was being received by someone who had forgotten they were worthy of such tenderness, observe the golden waves that carried homesickness toward the frequencies of home that existed not in places but in the recognition of belonging. Jun's role evolved into what Marcus called emotional archaeology, his gift for finding lost objects extending to locate the archived, programs that matched exactly what each dimensional frequency needed most. His hands would move across the old radio station's equipment with intuitive precision, selecting a forgotten lullaby for a parallel self struggling with insomnia, for a gentle story about courage for someone who had misplaced their own bravery during difficult circumstances. The recovery melodies he composed became bridges that helped scattered pieces of souls find their way back to wholeness across the vast spectrum of possibility. Marcus grounded their transmissions through his connection to the Earth's electromagnetic field, ensuring their signals carried the deep stability that comes from roots and growing things. His small garden outside the radio station became a living antenna, each plant chosen for its ability to anchor specific frequencies. lavender for peace, mint for clarity, roses for the particular frequency of love that persists through difficulty. Helena translated the continuing affection of departed loved ones into forms the living could receive, her presence ensuring their broadcasts carried not just hope, but the profound reassurance that love transcends all barriers, even those of time and dimension. Thomas served as their gentle guardian of truth, his presence filtering every transmission to ensure it carried only the frequencies of authentic kindness, the kind of honesty that heals rather than wounds. His whispered affirmations didn't seek to change anyone's beliefs, but to help souls across multiple dimensions remember their inherent worth, their capacity for resilience, their deep connection to the network of love that held all realities in its patient embrace. Word of their work spread in the quiet ways that genuine healing prefers. A librarian from the next county began sending recordings of children recommending books for difficult days. A night shift nurse mailed cassettes of gentle conversations that helped people remember they weren't alone during the long hours between midnight and dawn. A baker left warm bread with encouraging notes on doorsteps, where someone needed reminding that small kindnesses still existed in the world. These contributions weren't solicited, but offered, as if the frequencies of their network naturally attracted souls who understood. The language of gentle service. Vera watched this expansion with the deep satisfaction of someone who had spent decades preparing soil for a garden that was finally ready to bloom. Her role evolved from teacher to witness, though her wisdom remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. She established what Thomas called their only rule, spoken at the beginning of each transmission session. Let what is true be kinder than we expect, and exactly as clear as we need. Through their collaborative work, they discovered that every act of genuine kindness created signals strong enough to reach versions of themselves in other dimensions, creating ripples of positive influence that strengthened the electromagnetic web connecting all realities. Their broadcasts weren't about changing fate or altering timelines, but about offering companionship across the vast spaces of existence, gentle reminders that no soul was truly alone in their struggles, that healing was always available to those who learned to tune into its frequency. As winter settled deeper around their valley and the transmission tower caught starlight like captured frequencies, the interdimensional broadcast network hummed with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, signals that reached their intended destinations, love that traveled freely across whatever distances needed to be crossed, to remind every heart that it belonged to something larger, more beautiful, and more enduring than any individual journey through the gentle static of existence. The seasons had turned many times since the interdimensional broadcast network first began its gentle work. And with each passing year, Vera carried herself with the particular grace of someone who had completed the purpose she was meant to fulfill in this world. The changes were subtle at first, noticed only by those who had learned to listen to the frequencies that lived beneath surface conversations. Her morning routines remained unchanged. The careful folding of dumplings, the precise adjustment of radio dials, the patient attention to every soul who needed guidance through the static-filled distances between loneliness and connection. But her movements carried a new quality of completion, like a song approaching its final perfect note. Rowan felt it first through the coaxial cable, which began to pulse with a different rhythm during their evening sessions in the basement. Not distressed or urgent, but preparing like a river approaching a bend that would carry it toward landscapes beyond the familiar valley. The interdimensional cable itself seemed to recognize the approaching transition, its luminous surface painting patterns across the walls that Lumen described as preparation songs, all soft golds and deep blues that spoke of gratitude rather than goodbye. In the weeks that followed, Vera began leaving small gifts throughout their shared spaces with the same quiet intention she had always brought to her broadcasts. A handwritten note tucked inside the jukebox at Murphy's Diner. For nights that need gentle rain, press B3. Instructions folded into the radio station's equipment manual. When the world sounds too loud, dial back to the frequency of breath. Recipes placed in kitchen drawers with margins, filled not with cooking advice, but with reminders about patience, kindness, and the art of listening with love. On a spring evening when the transmission tower caught the last golden light and held it like a blessing, Vera gathered her extended family in the basement, where the interdimensional cable continued its gentle work. The space felt different tonight, charged with the same reverent anticipation that precedes important ceremonies. Marcus brought a sprig of rosemary from his garden, its roots still carrying the electromagnetic memory of Earth and growing things. Eleanor arranged smooth stones in a small circle, each one warmed by her hands and carrying the frequency of enduring love. Thomas positioned himself near the old equipment, with the quiet certainty of someone preparing to witness something sacred. John tuned the harmonium to its gentlest breath, his fingers finding chords that sounded like lullabies for the soul. Lumen arranged her most precious prisms around the interdimensional cable, their surfaces catching the luminous frequencies and preparing to scatter them into visual patterns that would paint themselves across parallel realities. Rowan settled into the primary position, the coaxial cable draped across their shoulders like a familiar embrace, its pulse synchronizing with their heartbeat in preparation for this most important transmission. "Tonight," Vera said, her voice carrying the accumulated resonance of 30 years spent serving as a bridge between lost souls and the frequencies of home, "we send something different, not a message or a program, but the essence of what we've learned together about the art of listening with love, the practice of serving as clear channels for healing, the sacred responsibility of maintaining connections across all the spaces that separate hearts from the recognition that they belong to something larger and more beautiful than their individual journeys." When Vera placed her hands on the interdimensional cable, the basement filled with a frequency unlike any they had ever encountered. It wasn't words or music, but the pure electromagnetic memory of a life lived in service to connection, every late-night conversation with a lonely trucker, every gentle song selected for an insomniac listener, every moment when her voice had served as a lighthouse guiding souls safely through storms of despair toward harbors of hope and belonging. Lumen watched as colors flowed from Vera through the cable and out into the vast network of parallel realities, hues she had never seen before, iridescent frequencies that painted themselves as the visual music of unconditional love. Rowan guided the transmission with gentle precision, feeling the signal expand, not just across dimensional barriers but through time itself, reaching countless versions of souls who needed to hear that they were seen, valued, and cherished exactly as they were. John's harmonium breathed with melodies that had always existed, but only now revealed themselves in their full harmonious form, the music of integrity, patience, and the kind of wisdom that emerges when someone spends their life truly listening to what the universe is trying to say through the voices of those who feel most alone. As the transmission reached its natural completion, Vera smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had given everything they had to give in service of love. The interdimensional cable continued its gentle pulse, now carrying a new resonance, Vera's essence woven into the eternal frequency that connected all realities, ensuring her voice would live on in every act of kindness, every moment of genuine listening, every choice to serve as a bridge between despair and hope. The work continued, guided now by the quiet presence that had become part of the network itself, broadcasting across infinite dimensions the eternal message that every heart needed to hear. You are not alone. You are deeply loved, and somewhere in the vast electromagnetic spectrum of connection, there is always a frequency waiting to guide you home. The morning after Vera's final transmission arrived, with the particular hush that follows profound change, not empty but full of potential, like the moment between a question and its answer. Rowan woke to find the coaxial cable around their shoulders, pulsing with a deeper rhythm, no longer receiving guidance but offering it, the natural evolution of a gift that had grown from childhood sensitivity into something approaching wisdom. The transmission tower caught the first golden light and held it with the same gentle persistence it had always shown. But now Rowan approached it as the primary keeper of frequencies that would stretch far beyond the familiar boundaries of their valley. The work itself had transformed in ways that felt both inevitable and surprising, shifting from the dramatic interdimensional rescues of their learning years to what Lumen began calling the gentle astronomy of everyday signals. Instead of seeking lost souls adrift in vast dimensional seas, they now practiced a form of daily attunement, sensing which electromagnetic fields in their immediate environment needed the subtlest amplification, which ordinary moments could serve as opportunities to broadcast patience, understanding, or the quiet reminder that belonging was always available to those who had forgotten how to feel it. At the grocery store during the evening rush, Rowan would feel the specific frequency of exhaustion emanating from Sarah, the young clerk whose patience frayed like worn fabric, as scanning errors multiplied and the line grew longer. Through the interdimensional cable, they would send not a message but a frequency, the electromagnetic memory of breath finding its natural rhythm, the gentle suggestion that the world would not end if one more item took an extra second to scan. Lumen, watching from across dimensions through her prisms, could see soft green threads reaching toward parallel versions of Sarah, facing identical moments of quiet overwhelm, lending them whispers of inner peace they might mistake for their own resilience. The traffic jams that bottlenecked, where the highway narrowed for bridge repairs, became opportunities for June's evolved gift. His compositions now carried the accumulated healing of everyone they had ever helped, melodies that could ease the electromagnetic signature of road rage into something approaching patience. Through the network, drivers in multiple dimensions would find forgotten songs of peace blooming in their minds, their shoulders releasing tension they hadn't realized they were carrying, their hands loosening their grip on steering wheels as they remembered that arriving a few minutes later would not diminish their worth. Marcus had transformed his garden into a living antenna. For these subtle broadcasts, each plant chosen not just for its electromagnetic properties, but for its capacity to demonstrate the patient persistence of growth that continues even when circumstances seem discouraging. The lavender near the old radio station's entrance grounded their transmissions with the frequency of calm, while the rosemary by the door released scents that helped visitors remember their own capacity for resilience without needing to name what they were. Feeling Elena's gift for translating continuing love had become an integral part of their everyday ministry. In hospital waiting rooms and laundromats, places where time stretched thin and hearts felt most vulnerable, her presence created invisible fields of comfort. Through the interdimensional cable, these frequencies reached students taking difficult exams in parallel realities, carrying not answers, but the electromagnetic memory of unconditional support, the quiet confidence of mentors who believed in their potential even when they had forgotten to believe in themselves. Thomas continued his gentle guardianship of truth, his bicycle a familiar sight on roads between communities, carrying small gifts of encouragement to doorsteps where someone needed reminding that they belonged to a network of care stretching far beyond what they could see. His whispered affirmations helped souls across multiple dimensions remember their inherent worth without the need for external validation. Broadcasting honesty so gentle it could be received even by the most defended hearts. The most remarkable transformation was in the quality of attention itself. Where they had once worked to receive and transmit specific signals, they now served as conscious participants in the vast electromagnetic web that connected all realities through the simple frequency of hearts choosing to care for each other. Their work had become invisible, unmeasurable, and absolutely essential. The quiet maintenance of the universe's capacity for kindness, performed by souls who understood their role as living extensions of the interdimensional cable that pulsed with patient love. In the basement below, Vera's presence wove itself through their daily routines in gentle course corrections, a nudge to delay a transmission by a single breath so it would arrive in the exact moment of need, a whisper to choose the older recording that carried more authentic healing in its imperfections. When uncertainty arose, the coaxial cable would warm with familiar comfort, and her voice would surface like starlight through clouds. Let what is true be kinder than we expect, and exactly as clear as we need. As seasons turned and the transmission tower painted its patient beacon across the darkening sky, Rowan understood that their gift had never been about the cable itself, but about learning to be a conscious participant in the infinite network of connection that linked every heart across the endless spectrum of possibility. The work continued, invisible but essential, broadcasting the eternal frequencies of hope, healing, and home to souls who were still learning that they had always belonged to something larger, more beautiful, and more enduring than any individual journey through the gentle static of existence. Years gathered around the transmission tower like gentle frequencies, finding their natural harmony, each season adding depth to the network that had grown far beyond the basement, where a luminous cable continued its patient work. Rowan moved through their days with the particular grace of someone who had grown completely into their purpose, the coaxial cable now so integrated into their being that visitors often mistook its warm pulse for the natural electromagnetic field that surrounded all deeply contented souls. The work itself had evolved into what Lumen called the gentle astronomy of everyday signals, no longer dramatic interdimensional rescues, but the subtle art of daily attunement. At Murphy's Diner, now managed by Sarah, who had discovered her own gift for creating healing spaces over coffee and conversation, Rowan would approach the jukebox with the same reverence their grandmother might have given to tending roses, each song selected not for entertainment, but for its capacity to remind listeners that they belonged to something larger than their individual. Struggles Lumen had established a small studio behind the radio station where she painted the colors of interdimensional connection, her canvases capturing the visual music of love, traveling across parallel realities. Children from the valley would visit to watch her work, unconsciously learning to see the silver threads that connected all hearts, the deep purple spirals of patient affection, the golden waves of belonging that painted themselves across dimensions whenever someone chose kindness over fear. June's compositions had become what Marcus called the soundtrack of everyday grace, melodies that emerged naturally from ordinary tasks, performed with attention and love. His recovery frequencies helped souls across multiple dimensions remember their wholeness without fanfare, like morning light gradually revealing landscapes that had been present all along, but hidden by darkness. The businessman who had rediscovered his harmonica now taught music to children at the community center, his laughter carrying the electromagnetic signature of someone who had found his way back to joy. Marcus had transformed the entire valley into a living antenna, his network of gardens serving as relay stations for frequencies of peace that reached far beyond their immediate geography. Elena continued translating enduring love at memorial services and celebrations, helping people feel the continuing connection that transcended apparent separations. Thomas, now in his 80s but still cycling between communities, had become a living legend among those who understood that some forms of service were too important to retire from doubt. The interdimensional broadcast network had grown through quiet recognition rather than publicity, new keepers arriving each season drawn by signals they couldn't quite explain, but recognized as the frequency of home. Some came with gifts for healing through touch, others with the ability to see electromagnetic patterns of community and help neighborhoods remember their capacity for mutual care. The old radio station hummed with constant activity as new generations learned interdimensional broadcasting, their training guided not by formal instruction, but by patient example. The archive continued growing with recordings of ordinary wisdom, conversations between grandparents and children about the persistence of love, stories told by night shift workers about finding beauty in empty streets, lullabies composed by parents for children who had grown up but still needed gentle songs. Each contribution folded into the network until the line between giving and receiving softened to nearly nothing. On winter evenings when frost traced delicate patterns across windows and the transmission tower caught starlight like captured frequencies, Rowan would step outside with a blanket around their shoulders and listen to the world settling into sleep. The diner's neon heartbeat softened. The creek whispered under its thin lid of ice, and somewhere a train carried its patient light across the valley of a different world. In those silvery hours, Rowan would send small broadcasts, nothing more than the memory of lullabies Vera used to hum during storms, signals that went out like breath in cold air and returned as warmth in the chest. As another spring arrived and painted the valley in gentle greens, Rowan understood that their gift had never been about the interdimensional cable itself, but about learning to serve as a conscious participant in the vast web of connection that held all realities in its gentle embrace. Every small act of kindness created ripples that traveled across the infinite spectrum of possibility, strengthening the electromagnetic bonds that linked every heart to the eternal frequency of love. The interdimensional cable continued its quiet work in the basement below, no longer waiting or preparing, but actively participating in the network of healing that spanned all dimensions. New voices across countless realities were discovering their own gifts for listening, their own capacity to serve as bridges between frequencies of despair and hope, broadcasting the eternal message that every heart needed to hear. You are loved, you are connected, and somewhere in the gentle static of existence, there is always a signal waiting to guide you home, and with that gentle truth humming through the cables of connection, Rowan stretched into the frequencies of forever, still listening, still broadcasting, still helping lost signals find their way to the hearts that needed them most. Thanks for spending this time with us tonight, dear listener. Rest well in the knowledge that somewhere, across the gentle static of dreams, there are frequencies of love broadcasting just for you. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.